The man who walked her home that evening did not tell her his name. He did not tell her his title. He did not mention that the lane she lived on bordered the southern edge of his grounds, or that the lending library where she worked occupied a building his family had owned for 90 years before selling it to the town. He told her the road was poorly lit past the bridge, and that he happened to be heading the same direction, and both of these statements were accurate, and neither of them was the reason he fell into step beside her. Somerset, the second week of October, 1815. The evening had turned cold in the way that Somerset evenings did when the season was deciding to be finished with warmth, and Sarah Caldwell was walking home from the Lennox Circulating Library at an hour her father would have called imprudent and she would have called necessary. The quarterly accounts had needed finishing. They had been finished. She was not a woman who left numbers incomplete because the Sun had opinions about the matter. The road from the library to the Caldwell house on Briar Lane ran through the center of Combe Lennox, past the market square, and then along the river path where the lamps ended and the trees began, and the walk became the kind of walk a woman noticed she was taking alone. She had made this walk before. She was not afraid of it. She was aware of it, which was a different thing. She heard the footsteps behind her shortly after the last lamp. They were measured and unhurried, and she kept her father's walking stick in her right hand, where it had been since she left the library, because Edmund Caldwell had given his daughter 3 things of value: an education in numbers, a habit of observation, and a walking stick with a brass handle that could do meaningful damage if the occasion required it. The occasion did not require it. The man who caught up to her at the river bend was tall and plainly dressed in a dark coat that was well made but not fashionable, the kind of coat a man wore because it was warm rather than because it communicated anything. His face in the half-light was angular and serious, and he looked at her with an expression she would later spend a considerable amount of time thinking about, a kind of careful attention, as though he had arrived at a decision before he spoke. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not want to startle you." "You have not startled me," she said, which was almost true. "I noticed you are walking the river path," he said. "I am heading past the bridge myself. If you would prefer company for the distance, I am available. If you would prefer I cross to the other bank and walk separately, I am also available for that." She looked at the coat, the boots, which were good boots, the way he held himself, straight without being rigid, and the fact that he had offered her the option of his absence as readily as his presence, which was not the way men usually offered things. "The same bank will do," she said. They walked. He did not fill the silence with himself, which she noticed immediately, because most men she encountered used silence as a problem to be solved with the sound of their own opinions. He walked beside her at her pace, not his, and said nothing until she asked whether the path flooded in autumn. "It does," he said. "There is a higher route through the churchyard, longer by 10 minutes, but it stays dry through November. The vestry keeps the gate unlocked." He said this with the ease of someone who knew the landscape intimately, and she noted that his speech was educated and unhurried and entirely without the performance she associated with men who wanted their education noticed. They talked about the river, the path, and the library, which he asked about in a way that revealed he had been inside it and knew the collection. By the time they reached the Briar Lane turning, she had learned that he read history and natural philosophy, that he had opinions about the county road repair that were better informed than the magistrates, and that he listened to her answers as though they were the interesting part of the conversation, rather than an interruption between his own remarks. She had not learned his surname. She had not learned where he lived. She had not learned anything that would allow her to place him in the structure of Combe Lennox society, which she knew thoroughly. They reached her gate. "Thank you," she said, "for the company." It was a practical decision, he said. The path is uneven. She looked at him with the expression she used when someone was saying something true, and also not the complete truth, and she wanted them to know she had noticed. It was entirely practical, she agreed. He almost smiled. It was not a full smile, just the suggestion of one, held back by something she could not yet identify, and it changed his face in a way she was going to remember. "Good evening," he said. He did not give his name. He turned and walked back toward the river, and she stood at her gate and realized that he had managed the entire walk in such a way that the question had never found a natural place to land. Her father was in the parlor with the Manchester papers and a lamp that needed trimming. "You are later than usual," he said, which was commentary delivered in the form of observation, his preferred method. "The accounts took longer than I expected," she said. She sat down and did not mention the man on the river path, because there was nothing to mention, because a stranger had walked her home, and it was entirely practical, and she did not know his name, and she was not thinking about the expression that had almost been a smile. She thought about it 3 times before she fell asleep, which she considered excessive. She asked about him. This was not, she told herself, personal curiosity. She described him to Mrs. Felbridge at the shop, who had lived in Combe Lennox for 40 years, and could identify any resident by their silhouette at 200 paces. Mrs. Felbridge had never seen anyone matching that description. She described him to the Reverend Alcott, who knew every parishioner and most of their sins. The Reverend had no one to offer. She described him to her father, carefully, in the voice she used for incidental information. Edmund Caldwell looked at her over the Manchester papers, with the attention of a man who understood precisely what her incidental voice sounded like when the information was not incidental. He said nothing. The man on the river path remained no one she could find. She found him, or he found her, on a Saturday morning 11 days later at the market square. She was buying ink. He was standing at the bookseller's cart, with a volume in his hand, and the posture of a man who had forgotten he was in public, which was a quality she had seen in serious readers and in no one else. She could have walked past. She considered it for approximately 2 seconds, decided that walking past would be a statement and stopping would be a neutral act, did not believe this reasoning for a moment, and stopped anyway. "You did not tell me your name," she said. He looked up. Something moved in his expression, a flicker that might have been alarm managed immediately into composure. "Leander," he said. She waited. He did not continue. "Leander," she repeated. "Just Leander." She let the silence hold the space where a surname would go. "It is the relevant part," he said. She looked at the book in his hand, a treatise on land drainage, which was not casual reading, and at his gloves, which were fine leather and wrong for a man in a plain coat at a market cart. She noted the contradiction without resolving it. "Sir Caldwell," she said. "Both parts. I find the full name useful for establishing whether a person can be located if necessary." He looked at her with the almost smile. "Are you suggesting I might need to be located?" "I am suggesting," she said, "that a man who walks women home on dark roads and provides no means of identification is either very trustworthy or the precise opposite, and I prefer to know which." He was quiet. Then he said, "I will be at the river bridge on Tuesday evening. If your accounts run late again and the walk requires company." "That is not an answer to my question," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." He bought the book and inclined his head to her with the brief courtesy of a man who had been taught manners so thoroughly they operated without effort. And she noted the depth of the inclination, the ease of it, the way it belonged to a world slightly above the plain coat and the market cart. She was not going to be at the river bridge on Tuesday. The decision was firm and well-reasoned, and lasted until approximately Monday afternoon, at which point the quarterly lending reports, which were not due for another week, suddenly required her attention at the library until well past dark. She went to the bridge on Tuesday, and he was there, and they walked together, and the conversation was better than the first time, which she had not expected, because the first time had already been better than any conversation she could remember having with a person she had met once on a dark road and could not verify. He asked about the library, not to be polite, but with genuine interest in the operations, the lending patterns, which volumes circulated and which gathered dust. She answered with the thoroughness she gave to anyone who asked a good question, and he listened with the completeness she was beginning to rely on, which was a dangerous development. He asked about her father. She told him Edmund Caldwell had been a printer in Devizes, had taught her to read accounts before novels, and had opinions about ink quality that bordered on the religious. Leander laughed. It was quiet and real, and surprised her, because nothing about him until that moment had suggested a man who laughed, and the sound rearranged something she had been keeping in order. She asked about him. "Where do you live?" she said. And he said, "Nearby." "What is your occupation?" she said. And he said, "Estate management," which was technically informative and practically useless, and she told him so. 3 more Tuesdays followed. Then the Tuesdays became Tuesdays and Saturdays, and the river path became the river path and the churchyard route, and occasionally the long way around past the mill. And she stopped pretending the accounts required her presence on those specific evenings, and he stopped pretending he happened to be walking the same direction, and neither of them named what they had stopped pretending. She knew a man named Leander, who read her father's pamphlets and argued with her about the county road tax, and listened to her describe the lending patterns of the town with the focus of someone who found her interesting in the specific way she had always wanted to be found interesting, and she could not find him in any parish register or county directory, and this did not trouble her as much as she believed it should. Her father noticed. Of course her father noticed. Edmund Caldwell had spent 26 years paying attention to this particular person, and understood what her Tuesday evenings looked like when they contained something she was not mentioning. "You have been walking home later," he said one morning in November. "The evenings are shorter," she said, which was an answer to a question he had not asked. He looked at her over the ledger and said nothing further, and they sat in a silence that contained a great deal of information neither of them was going to discuss. The following week, Lady Thurston of Ravenmere Park announced she would host the Winter Assembly at the Great House in December, an event the county had not seen in 3 years, not since the old Duke had died and his son had closed the house to society and disappeared into what the county politely called private mourning, and what Lady Thurston, his aunt, less politely called an extended sulk of historic proportions. The new Duke, whose name Suren had never had occasion to learn, because dukes did not frequent lending libraries, and she did not frequent great houses, was called Leander Ashcroft. She did not learn this at the assembly. She learned it 3 days before from Mrs. Felbridge, who arrived at the library at closing time with the breathless satisfaction of a woman delivering intelligence. "The Duke of Ravenmere, have you heard? His name is Leander, the same name as your walking companion. Is that not a coincidence?" Mrs. Felbridge looked at Serene with the expression of a woman who did not believe it was a coincidence at all. Serene stood behind the lending desk as the words arranged themselves into a shape she had not prepared for, and thought about drainage treatises and fine leather gloves and an inclination of the head that belonged to a world above a plain dark coat, and understood, with the precision she brought to all important information, that the shape had been visible for weeks, and she had chosen not to assemble it. She closed the library. She walked home alone. She did not go to the bridge. The invitation arrived on a Thursday. The manner of its arrival was what mattered. She was shelving returns when she heard a carriage stop on the high street. Not a hired carriage, not a merchant's cart. A private carriage, black lacquer with brass fittings, drawn by a pair of matched grays, and on the door panel, painted in gold and deep green. A crest she did not recognize but understood immediately. The footman presented an envelope with formal precision. Lady Thurston of Ravenmere Park requested the pleasure of Miss Caldwell's company, and that of her father, at the winter assembly on the 4th of December. A carriage would be sent. The letter was warm and specific, and mentioned the library's importance to the town. The signature was Lady Thurston's. But below it, in a different hand, a hand she recognized the way a person recognizes a voice they have only heard in the dark, a single line. The collection deserves a proper audience. L. She stood with the letter and the carriage visible through the window, with its crest that said Ashcroft in gold leaf, and felt the precise sensation of a picture held at comfortable distance suddenly brought too close to see clearly. She sent back her acceptance because refusing would be a statement, and she was not prepared to make one until she understood what she was stating it about. Her father read the invitation at supper. He looked at the crest. He looked at his daughter. Ravenmere Park, he said. The Duke of Ravenmere's household. Yes, she said. His name, her father said. His name is Leander Ashcroft. She met his gaze. Yes, she said. I know. Ravenmere Park was the largest house in the county, the kind of house built by people who believed their importance required architectural confirmation. 60 people circulated through rooms that could have held twice that number, and the conversation had the practiced warmth of a county performing itself, for an occasion it had been anticipating for 3 years. She saw him across the room. He was standing with Lady Thurston and 2 gentlemen, dressed in evening clothes that fit with the authority of a man who had been wearing them since before he understood what they represented, and he looked nothing like the man in the dark coat, and exactly like him at the same time, because the way he held himself, the particular stillness, the careful attention, those had not changed. Those had never been part of the disguise. He saw her. She watched the expression she knew meet something new, a recognition that the terms of everything between them had changed. He crossed the room. She watched him cross it, and she watched the people in the room watch him cross it, and she understood from the quality of their watching that the Duke of Ravenmere crossing a room to speak to a bookseller's daughter was not a neutral act. It was information, and this county collected information the way her library collected volumes, systematically and with long memory. He stopped at a distance that was socially correct and personally insufficient. Miss Caldwell, he said. She had rehearsed this moment on the carriage ride. She had rehearsed several versions. She used none of them. Your Grace, she said, and the title did exactly what she intended, which was to place between them the full distance of what he had withheld. She saw him receive it, the way his expression adjusted by a degree so small that only someone who had been cataloging his expressions for 6 weeks would have noticed. I see you have been informed, he said. I have been observant, she said. There is a difference. She turned to Lady Thurston and spent the remainder of the evening being charming and composed and entirely aware of where the Duke of Ravenmere was standing at every moment, and she did not speak to him again, and it cost her more than she expected. The library roof failed on the 2nd Tuesday of December, which was the evening she would have been walking the path by the river if she were still walking it. The leak started above the history shelves, which meant the first casualties were a volume of Clarendon's history that had survived 140 years of English weather, only to be defeated by a Somerset Tuesday, and a county atlas she had been meaning to rebind. She placed 3 buckets in a pattern that captured the water efficiently, then opened the building records and found what she had suspected, the original deed of sale from the Ravenmere estate, executed in 1789, included a structural maintenance covenant that had been honored by the old Duke and entirely neglected since his death. The covenant was clear. The roof was the estate's responsibility. The estate was the Duke's. The Duke was a man she wasn't currently speaking to, which was a personal position that did not override a legal one. She wrote to the estate office. The letter was addressed to the steward, not to the Duke. It was factual, specific, and referenced the covenant by its clause number. He arrived the following morning, not the steward, the Duke himself, on foot, in the dark coat, and he stood in the library doorway with the December cold behind him and looked at the buckets and the ceiling, and then at her, with an expression that was not managed, the expression of a man who had received a letter addressed to his steward and understood it as the specific distance it was intended to create, and had come in person anyway. "You wrote to my steward," he said. "The covenant is with the estate," she said. "The steward manages the estate." "I manage the estate," he said. He walked to the damage and examined it with the focused attention she recognized from their conversations, the quality of looking that said this person understood what they were seeing. "The lead flashing," he said. "It has separated from the parapet." "You have experience with roofing," she said. "I have experience with buildings," he said. "Ravenmere has 47 rooms and a maintenance schedule that would occupy a lesser man entirely." He paused. "I am not a lesser man, but it occupies me considerably." This was the closest thing to humor he had offered since the assembly, and she noted it without responding, because responding would have been a concession she was not ready to make. He brought his surveyor the following day, his master builder the day after that. By Thursday, a plan had been drawn, and she had spent 4 days in the company of a man she was not speaking to personally, while speaking to him extensively on professional terms, and the distinction was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. He was good at this. She had known from their walks together that he was intelligent, and from the assembly that he was a duke, but she had not understood, until she watched him manage the repair, what those two things looked like in combination. The quiet authority, the decisions made without performance, the way he listened to the master builder and asked the one question that changed the scope from adequate to correct. He did not make the work about himself. He made it about the building. She watched this and recognized it, and placed it in the growing category of evidence she was accumulating, without having decided what the evidence was for. He arrived each morning at 9. She had not asked him to. He had not announced it. He simply appeared in the library doorway in the dark coat, with the surveyor's plans, and she let him in. And they worked in the careful proximity of two people who had a great deal to say to each other, and were saying none of it, and saying a great deal about lead flashing instead. On Friday, they spent an hour discussing the shelving arrangement, and at some point, the conversation drifted to the lending records, and from the lending records to the reading habits of the town. And she realized, 20 minutes into a disagreement about breadth versus depth, that she had stopped maintaining professional distance and was simply arguing with him the way she had on Tuesday evenings. And he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and neither of them remarked on it. The roof repair took 3 weeks, which meant 3 weeks of Leander arriving at the library with surveyor's plans and questions about the building and the steady, unperforming competence she was finding increasingly difficult to set aside. She had not forgiven him. He had concealed his identity. He had walked beside her in conversations that felt like the most honest exchanges of her adult life, while withholding the single most significant fact about himself. That was not small. She had built her understanding of him on incomplete ground, and the incompleteness mattered. But there was a but. The man who arrived at the library every morning was the same man who had walked beside her on dark roads. The attention was the same. The questions were the same. The listening was the same. The disguise had not extended to who he was. It had extended only to what he was called. December brought the winter dinners. Combe, Lennox, and Winter operated on the same principle as every small county society. The same families in the same rooms, conducting the same conversations, with the minor variations that passed for novelty. And Serene had been attending these dinners since her father's business had reached the level where invitations arrived without being solicited. She understood the rooms and the people in them with the thoroughness she brought to all recurring systems. The first dinner was at the Felbridge house. Leander was there, seated at the opposite end of the table, which Lady Felbridge had arranged with the transparent intention of a woman who had drawn her own conclusions about the evening walks. Serene talked about the library roof with Dr. Pemberton, who had practical opinions about lead flashing, and with Mr. Hale, who had no opinions about lead flashing, but had strong feelings about the county's treatment of public buildings. And she was aware throughout both conversations that the Duke of Ravenmere was listening from across the table in the way she had learned to identify, the listening that looked like attention to his own conversation, but carried a frequency directed elsewhere. The second dinner was at Ravenmere Park, hosted by Lady Thurston, who had decided the winter social calendar required her direct management and was providing it. A smaller gathering of 14, the seating placed Serene 3 places from Leander, close enough for the occasional exchange, and far enough for the exchange to be observed by everyone, which Lady Thurston had calculated precisely. She did not speak to Leander directly until Sir Aldous Crane mentioned the roof repair, and Leander said, "Miss Caldwell's standards are exacting, and I am doing my best to meet them," and looked at her across the intervening place settings with an expression that was no longer the careful one, but the one beneath it, the one she had first seen at her gate in October, when he had almost smiled, and she had not known what he was holding back. She held his gaze 2 seconds longer than required. Then she turned back to Mrs. Pemberton and resumed discussing subscription fees, and the dinner continued, and Lady Thurston looked at her nephew and then at Serene with the satisfaction of a woman cataloging a development. Afterward, in the entrance hall, Lady Thurston appeared at her side. "The library roof," she said. "He has been personally managing the repair." "He has," Serene said. "He has not personally managed a building project since the East Wing restoration 2 years ago," Lady Thurston said. "And that was his own residence." She looked at Serene with the direct attention that was, Serene realized, the family trait. "He's been different since October. He was not different before. Not for 3 years. Not since." She stopped. The incomplete sentence told Serene something, the same way Leander's refusal to give his surname had told her something, by the shape of what was missing. Not since his previous experience with being known, Serene said. Lady Thurston smiled, small and genuine, carrying the weight of a woman who had watched her nephew close himself for 3 years and was now watching him reopen. "He walked the grounds alone for 3 years," she said. "Then in October he started walking into town in a coat I did not recognize and coming home later than the grounds required, and I asked no questions because whatever he was doing was bringing him back to the table with an expression I had not seen since before Charlotte." Charlotte. The name arrived like a stone dropped into still water, and Serene understood that this was the name that belonged in the space Lady Thurston had not completed, and in the space Leander had been building an unnamed walk-around for 3 years. She did not ask about Charlotte. Charlotte was not a question for Lady Thurston. Charlotte was a question for the man who had walked her home on dark roads and given her everything except the one thing that would have explained why he was walking in the dark in the first place. She rode home in their hired carriage and thought about a man who had been walking alone for 3 years before he walked beside her, and about a name that explained the shape of every silence he had offered her since October. She was not sure anymore whether what he had done was a deception or the most honest thing he had ever done. January brought the county assemblies. 40 families circulating through the same rooms they had circulated through for generations, carrying the same conversations and the occasional new piece of information that passed among them with the velocity of something anticipated and now confirmed. The new information was Seren Caldwell. She had been received in Combe Lennox society for 3 years, with the cautious courtesy extended to a bookseller's daughter, who was presentable and useful and not threatening. The arrangement had changed. The Duke of Ravenmere was repairing her roof personally. Lady Thurston had taken her arm. The county had noticed all of it, and the recalibration was underway. The January assembly was at Crane Hall, a house that had been in the Crane family for 160 years, and showed it with a combination of dignity and inconvenient plumbing. 40 people, the full winter circuit. Seren arrived with her father, who attended these occasions with the patient endurance of a man who preferred his accounts to his neighbors, but understood the commercial value of being seen. The evening proceeded as these evenings did, the circuits of the room, the conversations that overlapped and separated, the careful choreography of 40 people managing their relationships in a public space. Seren talked with Lady Felbridge about the spring acquisitions. She talked with the Reverend Alcott about the churchyard path, which needed repair before the thaw. She was aware of Leander's position in the room, with the continuous attention she had developed over months of dinners, the awareness that operated below the social surface and tracked him without appearing to. She was discussing the churchyard path with the Reverend when Mrs. Ashmore arrived at her left side, with the purposeful approach of a woman who had selected her moment and her audience. 4 people were within easy hearing: the Reverend, Lady Felbridge, Dr. Pemberton's wife, and Sir Aldous himself passing with a glass of wine and the oblivious goodwill of a host who believed all his guests were enjoying themselves. Miss Caldwell, Mrs. Ashmore said with brightness that was not bright at all. How wonderful that the library continues to thrive. Such an important little institution. The word little did its work precisely. Seren recognized the technique, the diminishment delivered as compliment. "Thank you," she said. "The collection has grown considerably this year." Demain, Ashmore smiled. One does wonder whether such a small operation truly warrants the level of attention it has been receiving. She paused. From certain quarters. "The library serves 300 readers," Seren said, with the composure she had maintained since she was 16 and had stood behind her father's counter and listened to men twice her age explain why a woman could not manage accounts. "The attention it receives is proportionate to its function." Mrs. Ashmore's smile sharpened. "Of course. I only meant that a lending library is, after all, a commercial enterprise. One hopes the professional relationship remains appropriate to the nature of the service." Seren felt the room listening. She felt the sentence she had been preparing rising in her chest, the one that would dismantle Mrs. Ashmore's position with factual precision. She did not deliver it. Leander's voice arrived first. "The Lennox Circulating Library," he said from behind Mrs. Ashmore, in a register Seren had not heard before, the one that carried the weight of a title and understood exactly how much weight that was, holds the most comprehensive regional history collection in Somerset. He stepped forward, repositioning the geometry of the conversation entirely. "The structural maintenance covenant between the Ravenmere estate and the library building has been in effect since 1789. The current repairs fulfill an obligation my family has held for 27 years. He looked at Mrs. Ashmore with the full, direct attention that left no comfortable space for pretending she had meant something other than what she had meant. Any informed member of this county would understand the nature of the arrangement. I am confident we are all informed." Mrs. Ashmore said something about the weather and excused herself with the efficiency of a woman retreating to familiar ground. Seren stood beside the Duke of Ravenmere and thought about the specific quality of what he had said, the way he had made it about the building and the covenant, and the collection, the way he had not made her a cause or a project, but had simply corrected an error in the room's information. She found Lady Thurston near the fireplace. "He did not have to do that," Seren said. "No," Lady Thurston agreed. "He made it about the building," Seren said. "So that Mrs. Ashmore had no ground to stand on," Lady Thurston said. "So that the room received a fact rather than a declaration, and so that you were supported without being spoken for." She paused. "That is not a quality he learned from the title. That is a quality he has despite it." Seren looked across the room at the man who had once walked her home without telling her his name, and had now used his full name to hold a room steady around her. She had been holding the deception against him for 6 weeks. She was finding, in the quiet after Mrs. Ashmore's retreat, that what she was holding was getting lighter. He came to the library on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the assembly, soon enough to mean something, and deliberate enough to mean he had thought about it first. She was cataloging new acquisitions when he appeared in the doorway in the dark coat. The one she now understood was not a disguise, but a preference, and he said something she had not expected. "I owe you the truth about Charlotte," he said, "and I owe you the truth about the coat." She set down the catalog. She understood that he had come to complete something that had been left unfinished, and that the completion was going to cost him. "Come in," she said. He sat in the patron's chair across from the desk, and the ordinariness of the chair seemed to settle him, and he told her. Charlotte Ashcroft had been his wife for 4 years, beautiful, accomplished, admired by the county, selected by his mother with careful judgment. She had married the Duke of Ravenmere with the complete commitment of a woman who knew exactly what she was acquiring. She had not married Leander. She had married the house, the title, the position, the county's regard. She had performed the role of duchess with flawless precision, and she had maintained toward her husband a courtesy so consistent that it had taken him 2 years to understand. The courtesy was all there was. "She died in the 3rd winter," he said. "A fever that moved through the county. 3 households lost someone. Ravenmere lost a duchess." He paused. "I grieved, but I was not certain what I was grieving. I was not grieving a love. I was grieving the confirmation that I had never been visible inside my own name. She had looked at me for 4 years and seen the house and the title and the county's expectations, and I had been standing inside all of it, and she had not once looked past it to find me there." He stopped. He looked at the desk between them, at the catalog she had set down, at the ink on her fingers. "The coat," he said. "After Charlotte, I closed the house. For 3 years I walked the estate and the county alone, in a coat that had no crest and no meaning, and I gave no one my surname." He stopped. He started again. "I wanted to know whether there was a version of myself that someone could see without the house behind me." He looked at her. "And then I walked you home on a Tuesday evening, and you looked at me, and I understood within 10 minutes that you were seeing me, just me, and I could not bring myself to put the house back on." The library was quiet. The morning light came through the repaired windows and fell across the desk between them, and Seren felt the weeks of anger she had been maintaining undergo a structural revision. She considered what it meant to be invisible inside your own name. She considered what it meant to remove the name and walk in the dark, and find that someone looked at you as though you were sufficient without it. She considered her own experience, the bookseller's daughter, the woman received by the county as useful and presentable and not threatening, and understood that the distance between his experience and hers was smaller than the distance between a duke and a bookseller's daughter should have been. "You were not deceiving me," she said. "You were testing something. You were trying to find out whether you existed without the title." He was quiet. "Yes," he said. "And you found out," she said. Yes, he said. I found out on the first evening. The rest was, he paused, cowardice. He did not flinch from the word. He let it stand in the room, and she understood he had chosen it deliberately, that he could have said caution or uncertainty, and had chosen the accurate one instead. And she found this, against the remaining architecture of her anger, more persuasive than any explanation would have been. Why did you not tell me, she said, after the first evening, after the second, after any of the Tuesdays, when I asked where you lived, and you said nearby? He was quiet for a long moment. Because you argued with me about the county road tax, he said, and you told me your father's opinions about ink were religious, and you described the lending patterns of this town as though they were the most important data in Somerset. And you looked at me as though I were a person having a conversation, not a title receiving an audience. He paused. And I was afraid that the moment I told you, you would stop. She looked at the dark coat and the expression that had nothing managed in it, and thought about a man who had walked her home at her pace, not his, and had been afraid that telling her the truth would end the only conversation in 3 years where someone had spoken to him as though he were real. She did not say she forgave him. Forgiveness implied a wrong that required pardoning, and what he had done was more complicated than wrong, and what she felt was more complicated than pardon. I need time, she said. He nodded. He stood. Thank you, he said, for listening. She watched him leave, and she sat at the desk for a long time after, and the morning's work waited. The evidence arrived in the building records, which was appropriate, because the building records were where she kept the truth about things, and the truth about Leander Ashcroft had been in the building records longer than she had known him. It was February. The roof repair was complete. She was filing the final invoices when she found the instruction sheet from the Ravenmere estate office, tucked behind the surveyor's report, written in his hand. She recognized the handwriting from the single line on Lady Thurston's invitation, and she read the instruction with the focused attention of a woman who understood that what she was reading was not meant to be found. The instruction directed replacement of the full north side roofing, not merely the damaged section covered by the covenant. It specified materials that exceeded the covenant's requirements. It allocated the additional cost to the Duke's personal accounts, not the estate ledger. And at the bottom, a single line. The work is for the building. Do not inform Miss Caldwell. The covenant covers the obligation. The rest is not an obligation. It is a correction for 30 years of neglect that should not have required her letter to address. She read this 3 times. She sat in the library with the instruction in her hands and the February light coming through windows he had reglazed, in the building he had repaired beyond what was required, at a cost he had absorbed without telling her, with an explicit instruction that she should not know. She thought about the assembly and the sentence he had spoken to Mrs. Ashmore. She thought about the Tuesdays, and Charlotte, and the coat, and the man who had been afraid that telling her the truth would end the conversation. She thought about weeks of anger that had been the anger of a woman who had felt the ground shift and mistaken the shifting for betrayal when it was something else entirely. It was the ground settling into a truer position. The deception had not been about hiding from her. It had been about finding himself, and she had been the person who confirmed there was something there to find, and she could not hold that against him any longer. She closed the drawer. She put on her coat. She locked the library. She walked to Ravenmere Park in the February cold, on the river path, past the bridge where they had met on Tuesdays, through the churchyard, up the long drive she had only ever traveled by carriage, and she arrived at the front door in her working dress, with ink on her fingers and the instruction sheet in her pocket. When the footman showed her to the study, where the Duke of Ravenmere was reviewing estate accounts, she stood in the doorway and said the thing she had come to say. You repaired the entire north side, she said. He looked up. He looked at her in the doorway, in her working dress, with the walk from town still visible in the cold on her face, and his expression did the thing she had been cataloging since October, the managed surface giving way to the actual person, except this time the surface did not come back. You found the instruction sheet, he said. You told your steward not to inform me. I did, because you did not want me to think you were purchasing something. He stood. No, he said. I did not want you to think I was performing a generosity that was actually a debt. The building was neglected for 30 years. My family owed the repair. I paid what was owed. You paid more than was owed, she said. You paid what was right. He was quiet. Those are different amounts, she said, and I find the distinction worth noting. She set the instruction sheet on his desk, beside the estate accounts. I walked here, she said. He looked at the desk. He looked at her. From the library, he said. From the library. She met his gaze. The same path. The river. The bridge. The churchyard gate. He came around the desk and stood before her with the estate accounts behind him and the February afternoon through the tall windows. You walked here, he said. I am walking the same direction, she said, and this time I mean it. He understood. She saw him understand. The words from the first evening, his words, the excuse he had offered at the river bend, and she had handed them back with the complete truth restored. He took her hand. She let him take it. His grip was steady and deliberate, the grip of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding. Leander, she said, his name without the title, his name as she had first learned it, when it was the only part and the relevant part. Seren, he said. And her name in his voice had all of October and November and December and every cold Tuesday in it, and none of it was a wound anymore. February in Combe Lennox was not the month for announcements. February was for enduring, for managing the last of the winter with grim practicality. Announcements were for spring, when the county could receive them properly. They announced it in February anyway. Lady Thurston received the news first because she had positioned herself to receive it for 3 months and was not going to be displaced by the calendar. She looked at her nephew and said, "The bookseller's daughter." He said, "The woman who manages the most comprehensive regional history collection in Somerset." Lady Thurston smiled. The real one, the one that had survived 58 years of society. "She is not Charlotte," Lady Thurston said. "No," Leander said. "She is considerably more inconvenient." Lady Thurston looked at him. His expression had a quality she had not seen in this house since before the old Duke died, a lightness that did not diminish the seriousness, but existed alongside it. "Good," Lady Thurston said. Charlotte was convenient. I have had enough of convenient. Edmund Caldwell received the news at his breakfast table. He set down the Manchester papers and looked at his daughter with the undivided attention he had brought to this particular person since the day she was born. "The Duke of Ravenmere," he said. "The man who walked me home in October," she said. "Those are the same person," her father said. "They are," she said. "And the fact that I met one before I met the other is the reason I am certain." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Is he good enough for you?" he said. She thought about this honestly. He repaired the library roof beyond the covenant and paid the difference from his personal accounts and instructed his steward not to tell me. He defended my work at an assembly without making me a cause. And he walked beside me on dark roads at my pace, not his, for 6 weeks, because he wanted to know if someone could see him without the house behind him. She looked at her father. "He's trying to be good enough," she said. "That is the best version of the answer." Her father nodded. "It is," he said. He wrote to the Duke that afternoon, a letter that was brief and direct and contained the exact terms of what the Caldwell family would bring to the match, stated without apology or performance, the way Edmund Caldwell stated everything. The Duke's reply arrived the following morning. It was addressed to Seren, not to her father, which told her something. It said, "Your father's letter was generous and entirely beside the point. I am marrying you. The accounts will follow. L." She read this twice and put it in the desk drawer beside the instruction sheet from the building records, the two documents that told her the most about who this man was. The county received the news with the velocity that only a small, prosperous, well-connected society could achieve. The reactions arranged themselves along lines of character rather than opinion, because opinion was what people held when they had no stake, and character was what they revealed when they did. Lady Felbridge was delighted, genuinely, and without reservation. Dr. Pemberton offered measured congratulations. The Reverend Alcott said a prayer of thanksgiving that was technically general and specifically pointed. Sir Aldous Crane congratulated Seren at the next dinner with the expansive generosity of a man who had never had an unkind thought and assumed the same of everyone, and his obliviousness was, she found, its own kind of kindness. Mrs. Ashmore congratulated them both at the same dinner with the precise social grace of a woman who understood that her position had been permanently revised. She said the correct things to Leander first, and then to Seren. And when she said them to Seren, she met her eyes, and Seren met hers with composed directness, and nothing further was required. Leander beside her said nothing. He did not need to. His presence was the statement. She thought about this afterward. She had spent her life being capable alone. She had managed rooms and accounts and difficult conversations without assistance. She remained capable alone. Nothing about standing beside Leander Ashcroft diminished what she could stand on her own. But she had discovered that letting someone stand beside her was not the same as needing someone to stand for her. She had been treating these as the same thing for 26 years. The distinction had nearly escaped her, and it was the most important distinction she had ever made. They were married in April at the church in Combe Lennox, the one with the good east window and the stone floors from the 14th century, the one whose churchyard path he had told her about on the first evening, the higher route, 10 minutes longer, stays dry through November. The vestry keeps the gate unlocked. She considered this as she stood at the church door, that the first true thing he had ever told her was directions to this place, and she had not known it, and the not knowing was the point. She wore blue, deep and clear, the color of something chosen rather than assigned, because Seren Caldwell had been choosing her own terms since she was 15, and was not going to stop for a wedding, even this one. Her father walked her in. Edmund Caldwell, printer from Devizes, father of the future Duchess of Ravenmere, a man who had taught his daughter to read accounts before novels, and had given her a walking stick with a brass handle, and had said nothing on numerous occasions, when saying nothing was the most precise thing available. He walked beside her at her pace, because she had never been a woman who rushed toward things, and she was not going to start now, even when the thing she was walking toward was standing at the front of the church, looking at her with an expression that had nothing managed in it. Leander watched her come. She saw his face do the thing it had done on a dark road in October, at the market cart, at the desk, at the assembly, in the study, the surface giving way to the actual person. Except the surface had been gone since February, and what she was seeing now was simply him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had asked for both parts of his name when he had only offered one. The county was there, Lady Thurston at the front, Lady Felbridge already crying, which was her practice at weddings and her particular gift, Sir Aldous beaming, the Reverend Alcott at the altar, with the expression of a man who understood that the ceremony was the least important part. Mrs. Ashmore, in the 4th row, in a hat that said she had accepted the situation and intended to be seen accepting it. She reached the front. Her father placed her hand in Leander's, which was the tradition, and which was also the last time anyone would place her anywhere, because she had arrived on her own terms, and the man beside her knew this, and it was one of the reasons he was the man beside her. She felt the grip she knew, steady, deliberate. She looked at him. He looked at her. She thought about the first evening, the footsteps behind her, the dark coat, the offer. If you would prefer company for the distance, I am available. If you would prefer I cross to the other bank, I am also available for that. She thought about every version of the walk since, the Tuesdays, the long way past the mill, the walk she did not take, the evening she learned his name and went home alone, the walk to Ravenmere in February, arriving in her working dress with the truth in her pocket. She leaned toward him so that only he could hear, and said the thing that contained everything. "Same direction," she said. He looked at her. The almost smile completed itself. For the first time since October, it arrived fully, without the reserve or the caution or the wound that had kept it partial, and she saw his whole face in it. And it was the face she had first seen on a dark road in a coat that meant nothing, and it had not changed, and it was not going to. "Same direction," he said. The Reverend spoke. The county listened. The April morning did what April mornings in Somerset did, which was to be so completely itself that there was no room for anything that was not true. And Leander Ashcroft, Duke of Ravenmere, married Seren Caldwell, bookseller's daughter, and neither of them let go of the other's hand. And when they walked out of the church together, they walked at the same pace, because that was how they had always walked, from the very first evening, and the direction had always been the same. And now they both knew it. Her father was waiting outside in the April light, with the Manchester papers folded under his arm, because Edmund Caldwell brought the Manchester papers everywhere and was not going to make an exception for a wedding. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the man beside her. "Well," her father said. "The accounts are in order," she said. "All of them." He laughed, the full laugh of a man who had been proud of this person every single day of her life, and had decided today was the day to show it completely. Leander took her hand. She took his back. They walked down the churchyard path together, the same path he had told her about on the first evening, the higher route, the one that stayed dry, and the April morning was warm and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been practical. And the answer they had both arrived at was that it had been, just not in the way she had told herself in October, when a stranger had offered to walk beside her, and she had said yes because it was the reasonable thing to do. And it had been the reasonable thing. And it had also been the beginning of everything. And those were not, it turned out, different things.